April 23, 1945. A field hospital near Weimar, central Germany. The white flags hung limp in the smoke-thick air. A young nurse whispered words that would haunt the American lieutenant for the rest of his life. "Bitte Sie schnell. Please kill us quickly." Around them, shattered walls trembled with distant artillery, and the dim light flickered as if recoiling from the horrors beyond the canvas walls. Exhausted medics moved mechanically, stepping around makeshift cots where fear clung to every breath. Outside, the grim echo of approaching chaos pressed closer, reminding all within that mercy and tragedy had become indistinguishable. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these untold stories alive, and we read every single comment. Now, let's continue. The lieutenant stood frozen, his M1 Garand still raised, finger loose on the trigger. Behind him, his platoon waited in the shattered doorway, boots crunching on broken glass. The nurses stood in a trembling line against the wall, their Red Cross armbands stained brown with old blood. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken from months of sleepless nights on the Eastern Front. They had dressed wounds in frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. They had held dying boys who called for mothers who would never answer. And now, as the American army rolled through the collapsing Reich, they stood ready for the vengeance they believed would come. The young nurse who had spoken took a shaky breath and repeated it, louder this time, her voice cracking. "Please kill us quickly." And in that moment, standing in the ruins of a nation that had promised 1,000 years of glory, she believed with every fiber of her being that mercy was no longer possible in this world. The collapse of Nazi Germany in April 1945 was not a sudden event. It was a slow-motion avalanche that had been building since the winter of 1942. By the time American forces reached central Germany, the Reich was operating on fumes, desperation, and the inertia of a war machine that no longer had fuel or purpose. The German Red Cross had mobilized over 500,000 nurses during the war. Many were teenagers when they enlisted, trained in sterile classrooms in Munich or Berlin, then shipped east to face horrors no medical textbook could prepare them for. The retreat from the Soviet Union had been a nightmare that stretched across 2 winters. Columns of wounded stretched for miles, frost-bitten men piled onto wagons, their frozen limbs snapping like kindling. Nurses worked in unheated bunkers, amputating limbs by candlelight, using vodka as anesthetic when morphine ran out. By 1945, those who survived had seen the worst humanity could offer. They had witnessed the systematic cruelty of the SS, the desperation of the Wehrmacht, and the vengeful fury of the Red Army as it swept westward. Stories from the Eastern Front traveled faster than armies. Tales of what Soviet soldiers did in East Prussia and Silesia, in Pomerania. Villages burned. Women dragged into the snow. Nurses executed in their own field hospitals, their bodies left in the mud as warnings. The Red Cross meant nothing to soldiers who had seen their own cities reduced to ash. By the time the Americans arrived in central Germany, these nurses believed they knew what awaited them. They had been told by propaganda that the Western Allies were no different from the Soviets, that they would show no mercy to those who had served the Reich, even in healing. So when the white flags went up and the sound of American engines grew louder on the hillside, the nurses gathered in the main ward, held each other, and prayed for a swift end. One of them, a girl named Greta, who had just turned 20, clutched a small photograph of her family in Hanover. She had not heard from them in 4 months. The city had been bombed into oblivion. She did not know if they were alive. She tucked the photograph into her uniform pocket, whispered a prayer, and waited for the Americans to come. When the door finally swung open and the soldiers stepped inside, rifles raised, scanning the dim room for threats, Greta stepped forward. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of that ward, it carried like a gunshot. Bit den Sienschen, the translator, a young corporal from Chicago who had learned German from his immigrant mother, turned pale. He looked at the lieutenant and repeated the words in English, his voice shaking. The lieutenant lowered his rifle slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and something deeper, grief, perhaps, or disbelief. "Tell her," he said quietly, "that no one here is going to die today." What happened next would later be described by war correspondents as one of the most unexpected moments of the European campaign. The American soldiers, hardened by months of combat through France and into Germany, did not fire. They did not shout. They did not advance with bayonets fixed. Instead, the lieutenant motioned for his men to lower their weapons. One by one, the rifles came down. The medic stepped forward, slowly, his hands visible and empty. He reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen. He offered it to Greta. She stared at it, unable to comprehend. Her hands trembled as she took it, and when she drank, the water was cold and clean, and she choked on the first swallow because she had not realized how thirsty she was. The other nurses watched in stunned silence. One of them sank to her knees, clutching a rosary. Another began to sob, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming confusion of being shown mercy when she had expected only cruelty. The American soldiers spread out through the ward, checking the wounded German soldiers lying on stretchers and makeshift beds. Some were unconscious, some were beyond saving. But the Americans moved among them with the same careful efficiency they would have shown their own. They called for supplies from the trucks outside. Within minutes, crates of bandages, sulfa powder, and morphine were being hauled into the building. The medic knelt beside a German soldier missing half his leg, his uniform soaked through with blood. He pressed a fresh dressing against the wound and looked up at Greta. "Help me," he said in broken German. She hesitated, then knelt beside him. Together they worked to stabilize the dying man. Outside, the late afternoon sun broke through the smoke, casting long golden beams across the rubble-strewn courtyard. The sound of distant artillery had faded to a dull rumble. The war was ending, but not in the way anyone had expected. The nurses who moments before had been convinced they would be executed now found themselves working side by side with the men they had been taught to fear. The American sergeant, a broad-shouldered man from Iowa, found a young nurse shivering in the corner, her coat lost days ago during a bombardment. Without a word, he removed his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and whispered in German, "Why?" He did not understand the words, but he understood the question. He simply nodded and moved on to help another patient. By nightfall, the ward had been transformed. The wounded lay on clean blankets. Candles flickered in tin cans, casting soft light across the walls. The smell of cooked rations drifted through the air, mixing with the antiseptic and blood. The nurses moved quietly, still cautious, but no longer paralyzed by fear. One of the soldiers found an old record player in a back room, its crank handle still intact. He wound it up and set a scratched record on the turntable. A waltz began to play, distorted and crackling, but unmistakably beautiful. For a few minutes, the war outside seemed impossibly far away. Greta sat near the doorway, still wearing the medic's jacket, the canteen resting in her lap. She looked out into the twilight, where the last rays of sun caught the smoke rising from the ruins of her country. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about the enemy, had been shattered in a single afternoon. The American lieutenant passed by and stopped. He met her eyes and gave a small nod. She looked up at him and whispered a single word that needed no translation. Danke. For the first time in days, he smiled. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal. The American forces secured the surrounding area, and more medical supplies arrived. The nurses, no longer expecting punishment, began to reclaim their sense of purpose. They cleaned wounds, distributed food, and organized the ward with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the American medics. The fear that had driven them to beg for death slowly gave way to something fragile but real: hope. One morning, an American medic named Sullivan, a former medical student from Pennsylvania, began teaching Greta how to properly administer penicillin, a drug the German army had never had in sufficient quantities. He demonstrated the injection technique, speaking slowly in English while gesturing. She watched carefully, nodding, and when she tried it herself, her hands were steady. Sullivan smiled and gave her a thumbs up. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. It was an acknowledgment that she was not a prisoner, but a colleague. The transformation was not instantaneous. Trust had to be earned in increments, in shared tasks and quiet gestures. An American private named Kowalski from Detroit helped one of the older nurses carry a heavy crate of supplies across the courtyard. She thanked him in German, and he responded with a grin and a few mangled phrases he had picked up. They both laughed, the sound strange and fragile in a place that had known only suffering. Another nurse, a woman in her 30s named Hild, who had served since 1941, found herself sitting beside an American corporal during a break. He offered her a cigarette. She hesitated, then accepted. They smoked in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Two people from opposite sides of a war that was finally ending. In those moments, the boundaries of nationality and ideology dissolved, replaced by the simple recognition of shared humanity. The wounded, both German and American, benefited from this unexpected cooperation. Men who would have died from infection or blood loss were stabilized, treated, and given a chance to survive. The nurses, drawing on years of hard-won experience, worked alongside the American medics with a precision that spoke to their training and resilience. They had learned to function in chaos, to make impossible decisions under fire, and now they applied those skills in the service of healing rather than merely surviving. The ward became a place where the war's cruelty was met with defiance, not through violence, but through the stubborn insistence that life still mattered. One afternoon, an American chaplain arrived and held a brief service in the courtyard. He spoke in English, but the message was clear. The nurses stood at the edges, some weeping quietly, others simply bowing their heads. When he finished, he walked among them, offering blessings and kind words, even though most did not understand the language. The gesture alone was enough. By the end of the first week, the hospital had become a small sanctuary. German civilians from the surrounding area began to appear, seeking medical help for injuries sustained during the bombings. The Americans treated them without hesitation, and the nurses translated, bridging the gap between the occupiers and the occupied. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the first tentative step toward something that resembled normalcy. The wounds of war would take years, perhaps generations, to heal. But in that small field hospital near Weimar, in the spring of 1945, something extraordinary happened. Enemies became caregivers. Fear became trust. And in the midst of total devastation, humanity found a way to reassert itself. Greta, who had once begged for a quick death, now moved through the ward with purpose, her hands steady as she changed bandages and offered comfort to the wounded. She no longer wore the haunted expression that had defined her in those first terrifying moments. The American medic's jacket still hung on a peg near her cot, a symbol of the unexpected kindness that had saved her life. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. In the field hospital near Weimar, the news was met with quiet relief rather than celebration. The nurses and soldiers gathered in the main ward, listening to a crackling radio broadcast announcing Germany's unconditional surrender. Some wept, others simply sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what had just ended. The American lieutenant, the same man who had lowered his rifle and offered mercy instead of vengeance, stood near the doorway and looked out at the town beyond. The ruins still smoldered. The streets were choked with debris. But the guns were silent. Greta approached him, her steps hesitant. She carried a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was the photograph of her family, the one she had clutched on that first day. She had received word the day before that they had survived, that they were alive in a refugee camp near Hamburg. She showed him the photograph, pointing to each face and speaking their names in German. He nodded, understanding the meaning, even if he did not understand the words. She reached out and shook his hand, a formal gesture that carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. "Danke," she said again, her voice steady this time. He held her hand for a moment longer, then released it and nodded. "You're going to be okay," he said in English. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. The American forces eventually moved on, replaced by occupation troops tasked with rebuilding and administering the shattered remnants of the Reich. The nurses were allowed to continue their work under Allied supervision, treating civilians and former soldiers alike. Greta remained at the hospital for another year, helping to train a new generation of nurses in the techniques she had learned from the Americans. She never forgot the moment she had begged for death, or the moment she had been offered life instead. Years later, long after the war had faded into history, she would tell her grandchildren about the spring of 1945, about the American soldiers who had walked into a field hospital with rifles in their hands and mercy in their hearts, about the medic who had given her water when she expected only cruelty, about the sergeant who had draped his jacket over her shoulders when she was shivering with fear. She would tell them that in the darkest moment of her life, when she believed the world had lost all capacity for kindness, a group of strangers had proven her wrong. The story of that field hospital near Weimar is not unique. Across Germany in the final weeks of the war, similar scenes played out in countless towns and villages. But it remains a powerful reminder of what is possible, even in the midst of total war. The nurses who served in that ward had been shaped by years of brutality, indoctrination, and fear. They had seen the worst of humanity and had every reason to believe that mercy no longer existed. And yet, when given the chance, they chose to heal rather than to hate. The American soldiers who walked through that door had been hardened by combat, by the loss of friends, by the grinding attrition of a war that had stretched across continents. They had every reason to seek vengeance. And yet, when confronted with terrified nurses begging for death, they chose compassion. In the end, it was not strategy or firepower that defined that moment. It was the simple, stubborn insistence that even in war, humanity could survive. The ruins of the town near Weimar still stand today, a quiet reminder of the devastation that swept across Europe in 1945. But the story of what happened in that field hospital endures as something different, a testament to the capacity for mercy, even in the darkest hours. Greta passed away in 2003 at the age of 78. In her final years, she often spoke of that spring, of the young American medic who had knelt beside her and whispered reassurance she had barely been able to hear. She spoke of the lieutenant who had smiled when she thanked him, a small, weary expression that seemed to hold both relief and sorrow. And she spoke of the moment she realized that the war had not destroyed everything, that kindness could still exist, even when the world was on fire and every certainty had collapsed into ash. Her story and the stories of the nurses and soldiers who shared that battered ward remind us that history is not just about the battles fought and the treaties signed. It is about the moments of grace that emerge when people choose to see one another not as enemies, but as human beings shaped by fear, hope, and the fragile desire to keep going. In April 1945, in a small field hospital near Weimar, a young nurse begged for death, and an American soldier, exhausted and trembling, gave her life instead, offering the quiet promise that compassion could still survive.